I don't have a gavel, but good afternoon, everyone. I think we're ready to get started. I just want to, my name is Aline Shuramoff, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Community Development and Engagement and our Center for Indian Country Development at the Minneapolis Fed. Minneapolis is the home to a national research center on tribal economies, and just really it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I get to serve as your moderator. And this is really the fifth in a series that the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, the Minnesota Humanities Center, and former Supreme Court Justice Alan Page are doing across the state of Minnesota. I think we all know that Minnesota is growing increasingly diverse every year, and conversations about what we need to do to serve this increasingly diverse community and increasingly diverse student body really needs to give children the opportunity to reach their full potential. And so we're here today in Bemidji and really honored and to be joined by Dr. Troyer. So I'm going to start with an introduction of our speakers. Actually, I'm going to ask the speakers to introduce themselves, and then we can maybe do a land acknowledgement and get started. Does that sound good? So Dr. Troyer, I'd like to start with you and also say thank you so much for hosting this conversation, and to all of you for being here with us today and anyone online watching.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be part of the conversation. Maji taingni wi ojibwe majines mi itago windamunugu gawian wagush indigu minawa migazi indodem kazaga squaji mekag indunjiba. So giving you a brief greeting in my Ojibwe language to let you know my native name is Wagush, which means fox. I'm from the Eagle clan, come from Leech Lake, and excited to be here and be part of the conversation today. As a matter of introductions, I'm not sure how much background you want. I'm a professor here at Bemidji State University, professor of Ojibwe, and I get to wear many hats. So I'm kind of working hard in indigenous language revitalization. I'm a community servant, so I officiate at ceremonies and things like that in our community. But I also do a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Training with K-12 educators, higher ed, and so forth. And I'm a published author, so they give me the mic a lot. But through the course of a lot of different kinds of conversations within indigenous communities and within the broader spectrum of education across America, I've come to see just how critically important the efforts to address diversity, equity, and inclusion are, and to render our educational system more fully functional for all of our learners. We've got work to do.
We do have work to do, and I'm excited to get really more into detail on that. Justice Page, could I ask you to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. My name is Alan Page, retired justice, associate justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, and one of the co-founders, along with my wife Diane, of the Page Education Foundation. It's good to be here in Bemidji. I was last here 2 years ago. I had the good fortune and the honor of being the university's commencement speaker. It was a great time, and one of the special parts of that day was that one of our Page scholars was a graduate. And so it's great to be back.
Excellent, thank you.
My name is Kevin Lindsay, and I have the pleasure of serving as the CEO of the Minnesota Humanities Center. The Humanities Center, its vision is a just society that's curious, connected, and compassionate. Curious that we come to conversations, open hearts, open minds. Connected, as Dr. Martin Luther King says, see ourselves tied into a garment of mutual destiny. What impacts one, impacts all. And compassionate, motivated beyond empathy to action. And we get a chance to work. I was meeting with an instructor. We had a conversation about the Bone Marrow Thieves, the book. So we had a chance to have a discussion with students here from Bemidji. We get to work with wonderful scholars such as Dr. Troyer in history and art and literature. So we're really appreciative of this conversation. Before becoming a CEO, I also worked as a Commissioner of Human Rights for the state of Minnesota, so I had a chance to get involved in educational equity issues in that capacity.
That's great. And I was wondering, does it make sense for us to take our masks off when we're talking? Is that okay? just so that it's maybe a little bit less muffled, so you have better sound quality. With that, Dr. Troyer, could I ask you to do a land acknowledgement?
You know, I didn't pull up the one we had just worked for about a year putting together for Bemidji State University, but I can probably paraphrase it pretty well. So welcome to Bemidji State University. We acknowledge that we are on the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Ojibwe and Dakota peoples. We acknowledge the historical injustices that have impacted these communities, but also the contemporary resiliency of Indigenous peoples. And we make a commitment to fight injustice in all its forms.
Well, thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. So you, Dr. Troyer, you started by talking a little bit about how you've started to get more into diversity, equity, and inclusion in your work. Talk a little bit about why that matters. Why is that something that's motivating you?
Well, there's a lot to say. I think fundamentally, when I think about the experience of my parents, my father is an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a Holocaust survivor. Spoke nothing but German the first 13 years of his life. He and two cousins and both of his parents made it out. Everyone else was killed in the Nazi Holocaust. And my mother grew up in a little village called Bena in the heart of the Leech Lake Reservation, population 400, and half of them are my cousins. I think for her, things like harvesting wild rice or snaring rabbits was less a cool cultural pastime and more a necessary means of survival. And as my father was hitting the restart button and my mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty, it's clear that education was the lever that enabled access to opportunity. My mother eventually, she only met one professional Native her entire childhood. That was a school nurse. And so she thought, well, maybe I could do that. So she went on and became a nurse, started working for the tribe's health program and thought, wow, the way Native people are treated, it's horrible. We got to do something about that. And then she went on and became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. I'm still kind of with George Carlin, though, as we think about, you know, everything that's going on here. We call it the American dream because we got to be asleep to believe it. Meaning simply that there are barriers out there and they are not equitably distributed. And education does not even guarantee you a certain outcome, but it's a lever that improves your chances of access to opportunity. We're at a time in America when the majority of the K-12 students in America are students of color, and only 60% of students of color finish high school. 50% of Indigenous learners finish high school. And it is not a recipe for a healthy country to take the largest demographic group of students in the entire country and only get 60% to the finish line with high school. We know that there's a tenfold earnings difference between not finishing high school and having a terminal degree. If we had perfect racial equity today, of course we don't, but pretend we did, our educational system alone would engineer racially predictable financial disparities. We have to do something different. The system is broken. We should want everybody to, you know, finish high school, go to college, get a job so they can be load-bearing citizens paying taxes and be fully humanized and have access to the best parts that this country has to offer.
Thank you for that. Justice, you've spent many years working in the education field and working with children, and you just mentioned one of the Page Scholars at the graduation that last time you were here in Bemidji 2 years ago. Dr. Troyer talked about education as a lever, and he talked about the trajectory that we're on today as really not a recipe for a healthy country. Can you talk a little bit more about your motivation and what you think from a trajectory standpoint in education?
I come to this question about educating children from the perspective of somebody who grew up in the 1950s. I had parents, fortunately I had parents who knew and understood the value of education. They didn't have the opportunity, they were able to graduate from high school, but didn't have the opportunity to get more education than that. But they understood that and impressed upon me and my siblings that if we were to have a better life than they had, then we had to be prepared. We had to be educated. You know, they understood that education is really a tool that anyone can use to achieve whatever their hopes and dreams may be. Now, there may be obstacles and hurdles along the way, but without that tool, it's almost impossible. I observed that, in addition, it seemed to me that, while not perfect, education seemed to be a tool that mitigated against the effects of discrimination. Now, they say not in a perfect way, but it did help to alleviate some of the issues that come about when people are inclined to discriminate against you. Couple that with the fact that as an athlete growing up, you know, you get put on the pedestal, and in my particular case, I would be asked to talk with young children about athletics and education and the importance of both. At the same time, while I was seeing in the athletic arena too many young African American males who were great athletes, who when their playing days were over, ended up back in Canton, Ohio, hanging out in the street corner because they weren't prepared to do anything else. And that didn't make any sense to me, because given my athletic experience, it was clear that if you had the ability to learn how to play the game of football, you had the ability to perform in the classroom. And so it became clear to me that tension between athletics and academics wasn't an athletic issue, it was an academic issue. And so over the years, I've spent a lot of time in schools, classrooms, talking with young people about the importance and value of education. As I noted earlier, one of the co-founders of the Page Education Foundation, I happened to have the good fortune to come here to Minnesota, marry a woman whose values with respect to social justice, with respect to racial justice, with respect to economic justice, aligned with mine. Norwegian though she was. And together we set out to do what we could on a small scale to, and I say small, I use that word advisedly, in an effort to encourage, motivate, and assist young men and women of color pursue education beyond high school. And we do that two ways. One, by providing financial assistance, which is no small means. But two, and more importantly, we require our paid scholars to serve young children, kindergarten through 8th grade, specifically in the area of education, as tutors, mentors, and role models, so that those young children could see somebody who looks like them, who comes from their neighborhood, using education as a tool to change their future. And 3 years ago, roughly, Neil Kashkari, the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, invited me in to talk about what we might do on a larger scale. And we came up with this notion that, not a notion, the fact, focused on the fact that our current education system fails too many children, particularly children of color, indigenous children, black children, brown children, disabled children, and poor white children. We concluded that the system is fundamentally flawed and that it's the foundation of the system that needs to change. And so we've come up with a proposal to amend Minnesota's Constitution to make education a civil right.
Thank you, Justice. And Kevin, you know, I remember you in your former role at the Department of Human Rights doing a lot of work on suspensions and expulsions and how that kind of manifested for different kids across the state. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe respond to some of what you're thinking of? Dr. Troyer said education is a lever. Justice Page said education is a tool that can help mitigate against discrimination. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I want to say maybe in the first year that I was a Commissioner of Human Rights, I had an opportunity to go to an event that was hosted by the Minneapolis Foundation. And during that event, they had presented data concerning suspension rates of young African American students. And within that particular report, they identified that 1 in 10 kindergartners have been suspended for more than a full day. So I'll say that again, kindergartners, 1 in 10. So that kind of struck a chord with me. I was wondering, well, what are these really suspension rates? How pervasive is suspension used as a tool for discipline within schools? So every school has to submit their suspension data to the Minnesota Department of Education. So what I did as a commissioner is I asked my staff to take a look at suspension data going back for 5 years. So in this 5-year arc of suspension data, what we found is that Minnesota suspends Indigenous children and African American children at twice the national rate. So across the country, it's regrettable that we are suspending African American children at 3 times what we suspend white, non-Hispanic origin children. But in Minnesota, we suspend those kids at 8 times that rate. And again, it is horrific that we're suspending Indigenous children at 5 times the rate, but it's beyond horrific in Minnesota that we are suspending Indigenous children 10 times the rate. And then when you take a look and you put aside sort of suspensions for what we would consider aggressive behavior or violent activity, and you're just talking about the interactions between students, and that's by far the most common reason why a child will get suspended for more than a day, it's even more shocking what you find within the data. And I'll give one fact as it relates to Indigenous children. In one school district, we found that children who had possession of tobacco, who were Indigenous, were 20 times more likely to be suspended in that school district as other children. Now, we can tout that education has worked for some children in the state of Minnesota, but when we're talking and coupling graduation rates, and when we're talking about suspension rates, again, not for violent behavior, at that level, we have to take a hard look at what we're doing within the space of education. And my story is very similar to both Dr. Troyer and Justice Page. My mother was the same age those kids, hour and a half. She grew up in Monticello, Arkansas, a town of about 9,000 people. She was the same age as those kids that integrated the Little Rock School District. My sister actually taught in the Little Rock School District. So when we talk about being removed from history, it's not past us. We're still living with it. And I think we have to take a real hard look at the society in which we're trying to create and what we aspire to be. Because Dr. Troyer is right. More children are graduating today in America who identify as, I hate the acronym, but I'm going to use it, BIPOC children. It just doesn't work. The math does not work. You cannot not graduate this number of students, given the number of students in that cohort.
That's really helpful, and I'll share for the audience that the Minneapolis Fed you're this regional Federal Reserve Bank. And when Congress created the Federal Reserve over 100 years ago, they wanted to make sure that we had representation throughout the United States to make sure that there weren't just a bunch of bankers in Washington, D.C. making decisions about monetary policy and making decisions about the economy. They wanted to make sure that there was national representation. And so the Minneapolis Fed represents this district. And one of the things that we've seen through our research is that the educational outcomes, the disparities in outcomes in Minnesota are really are really stunning. In some cases, I would say they're breathtaking, that we have 70% of fourth grade Black students can't read at grade level. And it's 70% can't. It's not 70% can, 70% can't. And so ultimately, what does that mean for the long-term trajectory of people's ability to participate in the economy? Congress gave the Fed what we call a dual mandate, which is to kind of manage stable prices and manage inflation, as well as maximum employment. And so our motivation for being part of these conversations and really participating in the education policy discussion is about our ability to achieve our maximum employment mandate. To the extent that there are people who have systemic barriers to participating fully in our economy, we need to understand what those barriers are and be able to try to support conversations around eliminating those barriers. And so I just wanted to provide that context. I'm being a little bit moderator and a little bit speaker here, just taking the mic, just to say that I think the points that you made earlier about people's full participation in our economy and our democracy and our society are real, and they're things that we're thinking about not only at the state level, but ultimately nationally as we think about the vitality of our whole economy and our country. So we talked a lot just in those introductory comments about what's kind of not working and what we're seeing as the state of maybe the education system. I do want to take a minute and try to go somewhere hopeful and talk about things that are working and maybe give some examples of things that you've seen. Dr. Troyer, I'm going to start with you, of things that give you hope in the education.
Well, America has the blessing and the curse of a lot of local control in education, also in healthcare. That's why it was impossible to have a national health policy. So sometimes that does not help us. But sometimes it can. And one of the things that happens in education is that because there's so much local control, you do have room for innovation. And if you look at some of the success stories out there, and there are some really remarkable success stories, we can find the things that we should all be giving a lot more of our attention to. For example, even though 50% of Indigenous students are not making a mark in state-mandated tests in academic English and mathematics, a little Ojibwe language immersion school in the Hayward Lakes region in Wisconsin, which has been going over 20 years now, for the first 15 years of operation, had almost a 100% pass rate in both, even though their teachers taught them all day long in the tribal language. It seems very counterintuitive, but it goes to show that when kids get to learn about themselves, as well as the rest of the world, it generates a different level of engagement with everything in the educational toolbox. I did a lot of work with Portland Public Schools. They're one of the really biggest urban school districts in the United States of America. Lorenzo Poe, who just retired a couple years ago, led their DEI work there. They have 58 different languages spoken in that school district and had almost completely eliminated racially predictable disparities in truancy, discipline, high school graduation rates, and college matriculation rates. Well, holy crap, maybe we should pay some more attention to that. There are about 30 schools in America that use an expeditionary model. There's one actually in the Bemidji area, a schoolcraft learning community. The idea behind the expeditionary model is that instead of having teachers be content experts who deliver to passive students who fill out a written exam, to have a broader definition of learning, assessment, and so forth, and that teachers should ask good guiding questions and coach the learning initiatives, and students should exhibit knowledge, and that can happen in any number of ways. It can happen through a science poster board project, putting a movie together, putting on a play. And so one of my kids when he was in 5th grade had a Columbus unit come up, and so of course I was curious, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, did you know, Dad, that when Columbus came over here, he never even came to America? I was like, yeah, I did know that. And even though he went to the Bahamas, he spent most of his time at this place called Española. Today, that's where Haiti and the Dominican Republic is. I was like, well, he's getting a geography lesson. It's a good start. And one of their ships was so damaged, they had to leave a bunch of sailors behind when he went back from his first trip. And when they came back the second time, they were all dead. And all these terrible things had happened and would continue to happen. And the teacher was asking us, you know, how did that happen and who's responsible? I was like, well, what did you do? Well, no one could agree, so we decided to have a court trial. And each of us wrote our own opinion, and we put Columbus on trial. I was like, oh, well, what'd you come up with? He said, well, I thought it was like 10% the fault of the Taino Indians. I was like, are you serious? Why? Did you know there were 2 million of them there on that island, you know, that they called Española? They only left 39 sailors behind, Spanish guys. And they started killing people and stealing their food and taking slaves, and eventually the natives got tired of it and killed them all. But I think maybe if the natives communicated differently, maybe that would have made a little difference. It's like, okay, what else do you get? Well, I thought it was like 40% Columbus. He didn't have to be that mean. Of course, this is a 5th grader talking. I was like, well, what else do you get? Well, I thought it was like 50% the fault of the Spanish Empire. They already believed that they could own other humans. They believed they could come to someone else's land and say, we own this land and all these people. If Columbus is never born, something bad still probably would have happened, which I thought was kind of a nuanced opinion for a 5th grader. And in the teacher, instead of thinking, if I say this, oh, the Italians are going to get me. If I say that, have you ever seen a native mom really angry? Whew, what am I going to do? As little as possible. And in that case, what you get is a teacher who builds the educational response not around the needs of the children, but around white comfort. So what I saw with the expeditionary model, for example, is just a different approach to curriculum. We've seen with the KIP program in Texas, you know, a student resiliency-based program, you know, disproportionately positive results. You know, the students are all reduced or free lunch verified, disproportionately students of color, and they're outperforming in all the metrics that matter. And there are other success stories that give me not just hope, but I think give us all a lot of ideas about what we should be doing and how we should go about doing it.
Thank you. Justice.
Well, what gives me hope is the children themselves. As I noted, I spend a lot of time in schools and classrooms talking with and listening to young people, and their curiosity, inquisitiveness, their willingness to look beyond the status quo, and their understanding of what's happening to them gives me hope that somewhere along the way, those of us who are in charge will figure out how to bring that out and develop it and encourage it. You know, somewhere along the way, we started focusing our educational system on how much information children could spout back to us. We lost sight of teaching children how to think, how to analyze a problem, how to come to their own conclusions. We seem to be on this path that requires that children think what we want them to think and not explore their own path. And I don't know that on the course we're on that we'll get to the point again where children are taught how to think critically, given the more than taught how to think critically, given the opportunity to think critically. But it seems to me that if we can shift the focus to educate individual children so that each child has the opportunity to explore their highest potential, um, that's when I think some of these disparities that we see, that's when I think some of the challenges that we face will start to go away.
Thank you. So Kevin, we've heard some examples of specific things across the country, ideas about educating individual children and children themselves. How about you? Tell us what makes you hopeful in the education space.
So I think a lot of the things that Dr. Troyer talked about are the things that give me hope. I mean, what I heard within that is meeting the child where they are in the classroom and not sort of teaching to sort of the expectations in the external world. The child is going to be the one who is going to inherit the leadership. And how do we as adults really center our approach around the respective child? That's critically important. And too often, unfortunately, it is, as Justice Page has said or articulated, we're teaching to having them repeat back sort of rote facts within that. But I want to be really careful here, because I think sometimes on these respective panels, it may come off or it might be heard among teachers that they are in fact the problem. And I would say they are not the problem. This is a collective issue. We as employers, we as leaders, we as people within the community, we have to reimagine, re-envision, and thinking about how all of us can impact the educational system. We're at a unique moment in time as it relates to, again, these demographics, to think about it differently. And the way in which it was articulated and talked about by Dr. Troyer is a pathway forward, and that is in fact happening. I had the good fortune today to spend a little time with Lorna Legou at the White Earth Community and Tribal College, and how she was talking about how the college was creating a welcoming, safe space for all of the students there and individualizing sort of the approach. That is the way forward for us. Unfortunately, that's going to require us to imagine and do it differently. And sometimes administrative rules or regulations get in the way, but you know what? Let's scrap that. Let's envision, let's do it differently. There is no reason why we, as a country, if we put our mind to it, if we can put 4 people into space who are not astronauts and bring them back safely, are you telling me we can't design an educational system that bears better results than what we have now? Come on, we can do that.
That's helpful. I mean, I always think about when I realized I asked a question about hope, but I also know that hope is not a strategy. And so I really appreciated kind of how you're thinking about ultimately what does it take to move the education system forward and to propel us forward. You talk about some more specific strategies now that we've talked about hope and that we've understood that that we're hopeful with each other, and the fact that this is a common issue and that you're all here to talk about this issue and that people are online listening. And Justice talked about the children. What are some specific things that you think we should be doing here in our local community or more broadly in the state of Minnesota? Dr. Troyer.
You know, first of all, I think it's very important to acknowledge that racism, for example, is not just an attitude, but it is a structure. As a matter of analogy, if you took, and to simplify variables, a white male homeless person sleeping on the street, people walk by him every day, and some people give him $1 with a little patronizing pity. Some people say, oh, get a job. And most just walk right by and ignore him. If you could wave a wand and have the attitude of classism disappear, how would his life change? Well, people might smile more, judge a little bit less, but would he all of a sudden have a home, a bank account? You know, no. And that's because the structure of economics and class is not an attitude, but it is something more deeply and pervasively structured in our society. It is the same with regard to racism. Now, when you look at our educational system, in America, in the state of Minnesota and across the country, there are some school districts that are funded at less than $4,000 per pupil. And there are some school districts that are funded at over $40,000 per pupil. Now, the rates of interracial marriage are higher than they've ever been. Our student body is more diverse than it has ever been, but we still have almost 90% of our students of color going to schools that are 90% students of color, and those are the schools that are disproportionately less well funded. And then we turn around and say it's the fault of the families because of the poverty, or it's the fault of the teachers because they're not doing enough, but that kind of inequity is engineered by us. So to render a more equitable outcome, we have to render a more equitable input in terms of how we fund and support education. Now, if you nationalized and equalized per pupil funding, who'd be crying? And it would be the privileged, right? And every time we have a proposed change in our educational policy, there is an effort to scoop up the fruits of that, again, for the advantaged and privileged. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to navigate the intersecting but distinct issues of classism, racism, sexism, and so forth. It's not either or, it's yes and. If we have a too narrow approach and just focus on the economics, we will miss the other dynamics that are going on, and vice versa. So I think our approach has to be multifaceted. By the way, there are some precedents. So like the state of Hawaii looked at funding disparities and declared the whole state one school district. Now that didn't eliminate economic disparities, because you can still do a local bonding bill and a wealthy community can juice funding for their kids over others. But it removed one lever, and we need to be attentive to all of the different levers. In a place like Chicago, they're still trying to bus kids all over the place, you know, in ridiculous fashion. And the pressure always falling on the more disadvantaged kids to endure the extra time, you know, on buses going to different communities rather than any kind of shared burdens. They're still not fixing the fundamental issue that we do not equitably attend to the needs of our children. And by the way, most humans sleep just fine at night, as long as their kids don't go to the loser school. So we should all be challenging ourselves, how come we're sleeping okay at night? You know, and working to change those kind of structural things. One other piece that needs to be said too is that our educational system grew out of colonization, which is taking one language, culture, religion, and imposing it on all others to supplant them. And although we have made many evolutions in what we're doing in education, we still have not divorced ourselves from that way of doing education. We've in fact narrowed down on a common core of academic English and mathematics to the exclusion of all other things that matter. Everyone's singing Mr. Holland's Opus, if you remember the old Dreyfus film. And we need to be attentive to all of these different dynamics that are popping up. Minnesota, and if you look at the states that outperform in aggregate test data, they are Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan. Are we seeing a pattern? And if you look at the states that have the highest racially predictable disparities in education, they are the same states. The whiter the state, the whiter the curriculum, the whiter the body of teachers, the better the white students do, and the worse everybody else is doing. But we cannot engineer, maintain, or be blind to a white empowerment program. We have to change what we're doing. We have to make it possible for all of our kids to come to school, learn about themselves, as well as the rest of the world, engage with a broad array of educational topics and aptitudes, and instead of saying we have a deliverable, it's beautiful, wonderful, and great, everybody should have some, and if those kids are truant, we'll drive to their house, we'll drive them to the school, we'll give them 2 spoons full of this, and the deliverable is a great big, wonderful, beautiful bowl of whiteness. Well, why should that be the deliverable? Why should it be delivered out of a bowl? Why should it be delivered with a spoon? The bigger questions are, what should the deliverable be? Who should be empowered to decide what the deliverable is and how we go about delivering it? Those are very different questions. So beyond cheerleading and helping, all of the disadvantaged kids get the deliverable, we should be re-examining what the deliverable is and how we go about administering it.
That's helpful. Justice, do you want to jump in here on specific strategies? What are we thinking about in terms of propelling ourselves forward from this place of hope?
Well, what I've been working on for, as I noted, the last couple of years is an effort to amend Minnesota's Constitution to make education a civil right, to make public education a civil right, and to make quality public education a civil right. Quality defined by, in broad terms, full participation in the economy, the democracy, and society. Creating a measurement tool to see not only how, as we do today, to see how children are performing. By the way, the measurement tool that we have for that is woefully inadequate. I don't even know that you could call it a measuring tool. But beyond that, we don't measure the system's performance. We don't look at how well the system is doing its job. We need to start doing that and put some of the burden on those of us responsible for what's going on. Importantly, our proposal calls for not only putting children first, but making somebody responsible for it, making the state responsible for it. School boards, local control, all of that is fine, but somebody has to be responsible for what's going on. And we would do that. And then the other thing we do, the construction worker sees everything as an issue of hammers and nails. So I'm a lawyer by training, so I see the world in the context of the law. We need to give children and families a remedy for when that civil right isn't being fulfilled. A remedy that they don't have now, a voice that they don't have now. By creating that remedy, it gives those of us who would be inclined to maintain the status quo a strong incentive to do something different, to solve this problem. And then finally, there are those of us who often, in terms of wanting change, we want to change people's attitudes. We want them to think better of us. We want them to empathize with us. I'm of a mind that I don't care what you think. I want you to change your conduct. And the law is a tool that will change conduct. And until we change conduct, how we treat children, particularly children of color and indigenous children, how we relate to them, will not change.
About a year ago, after George Floyd was murdered in the Twin Cities, we at the Minneapolis Fed decided to take up a series that looked specifically at the role of structural racism and the implications on the US economy, and recognizing that those structures that Dr. Troyer spoke about, that Justice was just speaking about, are things that do ultimately limit individuals, people's ability, or not ability, potential, or full participation in our economy, as I was talking about earlier. Really trying to do a deep dive on a number of different topics in employment, in education, in housing, in criminal justice, in wealth and health, and really looking at the historical context to how we got to where we are, and then ultimately where are there opportunities that could try to propel us forward. And so when we looked at the topic of education, we took up 3 different proposals to look at fundamentally changing the foundation of how we're thinking about outcomes for students. One related to implicit bias in the classroom, and Kevin, you talked a little bit about that in your opening remarks about how certain students are really treated differently and ultimately taken out of the classroom and pulled from their educational opportunity because of specific interactions that they might have. We also had a proposal on early childhood development on that 0 to 5 time period where there's a lot of brain development happening with little kids, and that's a time period that you kind of can't get back. Once they're over the age of 5, then we see that those kids, when we invest in their early childhood learning, that they have lifetime differences in their overall outcomes and their trajectory of their lives. They're more likely to stay in school, they're more likely to be employed, things like that over the long run. And then the third and final one was really about the proposal that Justice was just talking about, and that's really about going down to the foundation, ultimately using the Constitution as a statement of our values as a state. In the US, the federal government there is no educational clause in our federal constitution, but there is in our state constitutions. And the notion that we're basically providing a system that is adequate, and it's really looking at a system of inputs and not looking at the outcomes that are needed for children to ultimately be able to fully participate in our society and our democracy and our economy. So with that, Kevin, can you talk a little bit about your strategy? And then after Kevin talks, I'm going to open it up for folks. If you have questions either online or in the audience, so you can start thinking about those now, please.
So appreciate that, and it is a spectrum. There are things that we need to do to kind of change the ecosystem in which we operate within education. There are some things that we can be doing now within the current system, and then there's the need to reimagine a different system and how we move toward that. So one of the things in the tie-in to the amendment here, and also what Dr. Troyer was saying, is that if you look at the Constitution for Minnesota, it was enacted in 1857. And the language there as it relates to education is really framed around property, which is not to the individual child, and to the context of sort of where we were in 1857. This is very different for individuals who are African American and indigenous people. They weren't seeing it within that way. So that framework and how we think about what we are trying to accomplish with education, we have to have that as part of the conversation. Let's fast forward to the other end of the spectrum as it relates to things that we're doing right now or could be doing. Sort of sparking hope, and what you were talking about at the Federal Reserve. Justice Page and I have had the great pleasure of being able to sit in front of some kindergartners or second or third graders in various schools, and being able to actually expand imagination and talk about and use books. The Minnesota Humanities Center has been very fortunate to be able to partner with outstanding authors such as Dr. Troyer and others to be able to expand the books that are available to kids between kindergarten and 6th grade. I can tell you, early childhood family education, the number of books varies greatly between families. We could wipe that out. We have the money, we have the ability, the capacity to do that right now. We have the ability to support trying to encourage more people of color to get into the teaching profession. This last legislative session, unfortunately, in a budget of over $50 billion, we could only find $6.5 million to support diversifying teacher education. that appears to be something we could be doing more of. We at the Minnesota Humanities Center are blessed to have an event center, and we do professional development and work with respective school districts. So I can know firsthand that there are superintendents that are thinking really hard about that. But how are they to get there if we're only funding them at $6.5 million? And that's for the entire state. So the last thing I want to say is not just as it relates to sparking the imagination with books for K through 6, but having the real conversation we need to have as it relates to the history, and also how more thoughts and ideas from different scholars from different walks of life are valued. So again, if we were starting a business and the number of people within our business represented less than, say, 5% of the totality of the marketplace that we wish to sell to, do you think that we'd want to try and learn more about those other cultures and other people that we potentially are selling our goods and services to? Let's not lose sight of the fact that while there are millions of people that live in the United States, it doesn't start with billions. There's 7 billion people, right? So to this extent that we have people from different parts of the entire world, why are we not valuing their contributions? Why are we not learning more about their respective culture, more about their history, and how that could lead to better outcomes, better strategies, better ways about doing things? But that's going to have us reimagine that value add proposition. When you were talking, Dr. Troy, about that bowl, I was actually thinking about something my pastor said. The difference between heaven and hell is not really all that different. There's a big banquet table. There's lots of food. In heaven, people have figured out how to feed one another. In hell, the tools are so big, they're trying to feed themselves and they can't feed themselves. But they're so busy trying to take care of themselves without figuring out how to work together collaboratively. And I would say at this moment in time, that's where we really are. This is not a resource problem. We have the resources to do it. This is a will issue.
Did you want to jump in there? Go ahead.
I've got a question.
Sure.
And I know I'm really interested in what other people want to talk about, specifically with regard to the proposed amendment. Like, to be real and just navigate Minnesota's politics. We're a very purple state, not just because of Prince, but because of our politics. And I am certain that if we passed an amendment that made a high-quality K-12 education a constitutional right, that there are very powerful political entities that would seek to use that to say, aha, that means that we should be giving just as much money to private school kids for per pupil funding as we should to public school kids. And we should be reallocating resources that way. And I also know that through the course of national and state politics, we have an increasingly conservative bench that would be deciding the cases that would litigate such an effort. How can we be sure that this won't be another money grab by the privileged?
One way we can be sure is the language of the proposed amendment. All children have a fundamental right, not to an education, but to a quality public education. Okay? Mm-hmm. Hard for a judge to read those words and say a right to a quality private education. Other language, it is a paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools that fulfills a child's right to a quality public education. Mm-hmm. Hard to get around those words. Those mm-hmm. words are there for a reason. There is this concern that this is just a money grab to mm-hmm. privatize public education. The fact is that if Minnesota were to elect 2 houses of the legislature, which were inclined to privatize public education today, under today's constitutional language, and they were to pass a bill to provide for vouchers or whatever form it might take, and there was a governor in place to make that happen or to sign it, they can do that today. The difference between what we propose and what can happen today is, under our proposed language, now maybe I'm wrong, but I can't see how they can go down the privatization road at the expense of public education. You may go down there, but you can't do it at the expense of public education. And given the realities, I don't think it can be done.
It helps allay one of my big fears. I can still imagine last second backroom politician type deals. It's something to watch very closely to make sure that those critical parts don't get stripped out.
Well, I am this language that we're talking about, I am all for making it stronger. I don't have any problem walking away from it, and in a very loud way, if there's anything that makes it weaker. Because this is not about anything other than ensuring that every child in this state has the opportunity to receive an education that will allow them to achieve their highest selves. It's about nothing else. And to the extent that there are those who would like it to be something about something else, you know, that's not where I am.
I think the other component of that as well is that the proposal needs to be passed by the House and the Senate by a simple majority and then would go to voters. And so I think what we've understood and what I understand of Minnesotans as a relatively new Minnesotan, I've only been in the state for about 9 years, is that people really do, I think, care about their neighbors and care about how their neighbors' children are doing. And really do feel kind of the value of public education and quality public education. I think we all kind of feel that in our hearts, that we believe children should have quality public education. And so I feel if the language were changed in a way that didn't match those values, then I think it would be much harder to pass by Minnesotans. So I'm going to pause now and see if there are questions from the audience and or potentially questions from the internet.
If you have a question, you just raise your hand. I do have one online that we can start with, and then hopefully folks will call me over. Superintendents, principals, librarians, and school boards are increasingly under attack by local parents and community members for teaching inclusively, for choosing books and other resources that allow students to see themselves in the American story and in the curriculum. How can we best prepare educators to defend these attacks and strategize proactively? I would also amend it and say educators shouldn't have to just bear the burden, but what can we do as a society to help educators in this situation? So,
Yep, that's great. Kevin, do you want to start?
Well, I would go a little further than your amendment. It's not really an attack on the teachers or the administrators within the building. It's an attack on us as relates to our values. And we have to make sure that we raise our voice. We have to be present, and I don't mean raise it in an argumentative way, but we have to make it clear to all that this is really important and it's something that we respect and value. That's the problem which to me is going on within respective schools, is that unfortunately it's a very small segment within a society, but a vocal segment within society. And unless someone stands up to it, it becomes problematic and it takes over. I'm reminded by a quote by Dr. King that reminds us that all the atrocities that happened in Germany were, under the law, permitted. It's because people didn't stand up and speak. So the quote by Moeller is apt, right? If the trade unionists, they come for that person and I don't raise my voice, they come for the teacher, I don't raise my voice, and then they come for me. And there was no one left to speak for me. So what are our values? And it is not about just simply those teachers or educators within the classroom.
Well, thank you. We're getting really close to time, so I'm going to ask both of you to respond and maybe provide any closing remarks. Dr. Troyer.
Yeah, I certainly echo those comments. I mean, even in Germany, only 37% of the German population voted for the Nazis, but they still controlled the agenda, and look what happened, you know. I think it's important to acknowledge that as part of the colonial experience, which is about erasure, those who are steeped very strongly in that culture, one of their greatest fears is fear of their own erasure. And one of the things we're running into right now is fear of white erasure. It's an unfounded fear. I mean, even South Africa post-apartheid, you know, after Mandela, you know, and Desmond Tutu and all of it, still has an all-white national rugby team, and white people still dominate positions of, you know, economic, military, and police power. I think right now, as we sit here today, the very racially diverse Latinx population is being split. In the last census, they disaggregated race and ethnicity. You know, initially, the Irish were considered non-white, which I find quite ironic and humorous, you know, but and mistreated because they weren't. But eventually, the definition of whiteness changed, and the Italians were non-white, and then the definition of whiteness changed to include them, and that's happening now with the Latinx population. The color line still exists, but because it's such a big and diverse group. But more importantly, with regard to that, I think it's important to be aware that if your neighbor's kids do better in school, then the teacher can work faster with your kids too. That if your neighbor's house value goes up, then yours does too. And that in fact, as the late great Paul Wellstone said, we all do better when we all do better. And instead of fighting over who gets to be the oppressor and who has to be the oppressed, we should just pool our resources and efforts and fight oppression in all its forms.
Thank you. Justice, you have the final word.
How can you say it better than that?
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.